3. I'm sorry I'm a day late on my screencast for this week. As I said, I was traveling for a conference again. I swear my life is usually not that glamorous, and I got a little caught up in that. So you get them both today. I wanted to start off by saying I thought the discussion forums from last module really did start to get at something pretty interesting. And I think Michaela had probably the clearest articulation of this to get us started, which was how power patterns state action, right? The relative distribution of power is the thing about international politics that basically creates the environment. It sets the field. It defines the rules of the game, right? In some sense, you could think about it in terms of a game, right? Like maybe like basketball or something. It's not about, well, that person was really good at the free throw or this person, the game was really, it's instead we're asking, well, how big is the court? What is the court made out of? What are the rules? In international politics, those things are emergent qualities, right? And there was some really interesting things that came out of that, right? Which was that like something like nuclear weapons, therefore, patterns the nation of state action, right? Because nuclear weapons are so powerful and because they're so catastrophic, they actually change the way in which states interact with each other. Adam's point about the space race was also really interesting, right? Because what it got at was that it was the balance of power itself. It was the competition for influence. It was the development of shared senses of self between the Soviet Union and the United States that really drove states to compete in this way, right? And what I'm getting at is like, if it wasn't for the balance of power, if it wasn't for that ideological competition that went with the balance of power, would we have competed in the same way? Would we have driven these technological advances in the same way? And I think that the idea here is we wouldn't have, right? And this starts to get at this idea that the nature of the international system has a lot of explanatory power for why states behave the way they do. And that creates certain potentials, right? So many of you really grappled on to Haas's discussion of the Cuban Missile Crisis. I think that's great. I want to point out, yes, the Kennedy administration engaged in a lot of really deft diplomacy, right? There was a lot of negotiation. There was a really careful sort of management of the problem in order to get a peaceful outcome. But the idea here is that the reason why diplomacy worked, the reason why it was possible for these tensions to be diffused, probably had a lot to do with the balance of power. It had a lot to do with the relative balance of power in the system, and that's why we got the sort of negotiated outcome, why we didn't get another possible outcome. Ariana did a really great job of bringing up the example of Vietnam as well, right? Would we have thought about the expansion of North Vietnam and the civil war in Vietnam in the same way if it wasn't for the balance of power? And I think the implication here is correct. No, we wouldn't have, right? Remember our referent, right? So I talked about this a little bit. Yes, the Cuban Missile Crisis was solved with diplomacy. Yes, the Cold War was about ideological competition. Yes. But what we want to understand is the context. What drove that? Why did we compete with the Soviet Union? And instead just say, well, we're not interested and go off in another world. Why was it sort of possible for the Cold War to be solved through diplomacy rather than another way? Right? We want to know the context. We want to know why. And why did and so on and so forth. So the balance of power and the nature of the system are what drove these outcomes. They created these potentialities, right? And that system changes. And that's really the takeaway here from this module. The system changes. And when the system adopts different characteristics, we would expect states to engage in these kinds of events differently. What would the Cuban Missile Crisis have looked like if it wasn't part of a clear balance of power, right? Kind of scary, right? Because if something like that had happened and there wasn't a clear balance of power, maybe that idea of subtle negotiation wouldn't have seemed so attractive. States would have gone a different direction, right? Haas points out that what we're doing is that when we as a great power think about that, we need to understand that we're not just dealing with one individual outcome. We're thinking about the system itself, right? Trying to manage that, trying to manage the arrangement of the system in a way that's beneficial to our long-term interests and the stability and orderliness of the system, right? And that this is going to produce trade-offs, and that's important to realize. So things to keep in mind, though, as we go down the stretch, some things where I think a little bit more development could happen. Remember that the theories are different arguments for what is doing the structuring. There's usually an impulse for students in this class to say, well, I want to take a little bit of realism, I want to take a little bit of liberalism, I want to take a little bit of constructivism. And that doesn't actually work, okay? All the theories adopt the same understanding of the international system. It's anarchic. It's not anarchic, no formal hierarchy. States are the primary actors. They differ on whether or not there are some subsidiary actors. So liberals argue that institutions matter. Realists argue they really don't. And that there's these incentives. But all of them offer up different arguments for how that either is or is not coped with, right? So it's really important to bear that in mind. What you're really trying to figure out is which one of these things gets you closer to understanding how states actually are going to behave in this instance, right? They're different arguments. So for realism, anarchy, its incentives and the balance of power are what going to drive state action, right? Liberals argue that mutually beneficial, even if it's asymmetrical, some states get more than others, trade and institutions that are created to manage that trade create these shared expectations and make it more likely that states are going to engage in diplomacy. And then constructivism actually argues that states develop this narrative of self and their relationship to other actors through action. And it's important to note that in international relations, we therefore think that states their behavior will comport with what we call norms. Norms, using a very famous definition from Finnemore and Sekink in the international relations literature, are shared standards of behavior shared by actors of a given identity. If I think I'm a Western liberal democratic state, I have certain expectations of my own behavior and other liberal democratic states, right? I wanted to point out, though, that this is intersubjective, not subjective. This is another really important point, which is basically the idea that it's not that states individually just make this stuff up. It's that, as with society, states develop these mutually shared expectations that recede and become something just like common sense, okay? The other thing I wanted to sort of point out is that when you make an argument about these things, try to think about it in terms of like math class when you were in high school, which is like, yeah, you might have the right answer, but I'm really interested to make sure that you got there using the right process. So show your work. So I did find myself sort of saying this a lot in the feedback to the discussion forums. Look, this point seems interesting. Yeah, it does seem to be related to the idea of structure, but I need you to go through the process of showing your work. What do you think the structure is? How do you think these mechanisms are applying? Why does that lead you to argue the thing you did, right? And realize that all of these things are really, and this is hopefully going to help you with the theory, these are all trying to mitigate rather than replace anarchy, right? And this is the argument, this is where your argument goes. How well do these things fit to what you're seeing in the international system? And therefore, how does that help you explain things, okay? So that's really great. We're going to do that again this week in terms of a very specific patterning thing, which is the liberal international order. I'll have more to say about that in the lecture, right, which will come out with this video because I'm a little behind. But I wanted to give you a sense of what's going to happen next week with the reflection paper. Okay, so what we're going to learn this week is that the liberal international order is a very particular kind of international system. It emerges, in the institutions that create it emerge more or less right after the Second World War. They hallmark the American sort of sphere of influence during the Cold War. They're made up of institutions, trade agreements, and expectations about democracy, rights, and politics. They do create huge amounts of wealth. And then with the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, this becomes the global order. Okay. Now, Haas is under the argument that order is under strain and it's changing. And we are seeing some things in our environment that make it look like this might be changing. Maybe the balance of power is shifting and that's undermining these institutions, right? Maybe the American centricness of this is eroding because of the nature of global economics, so on and so forth. You, as sort of a budding expert in international relations, your job is to try to make sense of this. And what we're going to do next week is you're going to write a 4 to 5 page paper in the voice of an editorial for The Stylus, the Park University student newspaper, that sort of does this, right? That says, well, this is what I think the state of global politics is right now. I think that because this is the approach I'm taking to the idea of structure, and that means particular kinds of things for the things that are driving the headlines in international news right now. So you can start to see how this is where the sort of historical and analytical and theoretical material we've been covering so far this term becomes practical. These become tools that you use for trying to discern what's happening in terms of structure right now, and then using your knowledge of history to extrapolate from that to come to some sense of what we would expect states to do or what we should be doing as a great power to manage our interests. Okay, you'll get more of that as you engage in the discussion next week, but I wanted you to know that that's coming, right? And that's going to be the assignment you're going to write next week. Just to plug, Tuesdays, Thursdays, office hours, 1 to 3 Central. You want to call in, you want to send me an email, you want to chat, you want to show up, Copley 321 on the Parkville campus. Please do so. If not, I'm going to look forward to the discussion forum this weekend and reading what you have to say about the Liberal International Order. Hope you have a great day.